Ruffed grouse and their alarming path toward extinction. This video explores the elusive causes of the dramatic decline of ruffed grouse. What I found will challenge decades of conventional management that attributes the precipitous loss of grouse to a single source: lack of suitable habitat. Tackling 50 or more years of ruffed grouse decline is not something that can be summarized quickly. It requires significant background, history, and evidence to support a new, more targeted and comprehensive management plan.
40 years ago, ruffed grouse were found in 38 states. They were abundant across most of their historical range. Today, the species is in a prolonged, serious decline, with no signs of sustained recovery in any of the states they once flourished in. Ruffed grouse are heading down a path that looks similar to other bird species that have gone extinct. To really understand the severity of the situation, take a look at some of the warning signs that happen when a species progresses towards extinction. Extinction can happen when a population goes from stable then declines. If these declines continue, a population may become so small it's classified as a species of great concern. From there, if recovery isn't successful, the species may reach a low point where it's classified as endangered. If recovery efforts still aren't successful, localized extinction follows and may expand to the species going extinct. Now let's look at the path ruffed grouse are on. In 2025, 18 states have listed ruffed grouse as a species of great concern. Some states have listed the species as endangered. Some regions within the states already classify the birds as locally extinct or extirpated. Things don't look good, and they're getting worse at an alarming pace. This is incredibly sad to me. My name is Eric Taylor. I'm a conservationist, outdoorsman, game bird farmer, and I'm not an academic. For the better part of the last 50 years, I've been studying ruffed grouse. I raise a captive, licensed, and permitted flock of ruffed grouse from my own research. I've learned so much I hope to share with you. I've experienced some alarming trends. We have lost most of our local upland ground-dwelling birds in the span of a couple decades. Bobwhite quail, whippoorwills, and ruffed grouse are all missing from the same lands they occupied for generations. In some cases, the land has been developed, but in many places, the land remains undeveloped, either because of environmental constraints, restrictive easements, zoning regulations, ownership by land trusts, forestry management, agriculture, and wildlife conservation programs. Across all of these natural areas, thousands of contiguous acres in many cases, the grouse and other ground-dwelling birds are gone.
These birds and their songs have been silenced, changing our countryside forever, as if they never existed. To those of us who live close to the land and grew up with these birds, it's depressing walking in the woods knowing you'll never hear a grouse drumming or experience the rush of a grouse exploding skyward from beneath your feet. What can be done? Create more habitat? We've been doing that for decades, and we have never had less grouse than today. Some say, move on and try to forget about it. That's not me. I need answers. I make time to search for clues. Something caused this, and if we can fix what caused these birds to disappear, then potentially we can bring them back.
My love for ruffed grouse drives my research. If I find a study, a book, or anything on ruffed grouse, I dive into it until I've squeezed every ounce of knowledge I can out of it. One of the better books I own is a book published in 1947 by the Director of Game Management for New York State, Gardiner. The book is titled The Ruffed Grouse: Life History, Propagation, and Management. A quote from this book is what inspired me to share my research findings, thoughts, and ideas with the public. Here's the quote: "When those we love are in trouble, we do our best to help." Here are some examples of what I've done to help ruffed grouse. I've donated money to habitat conservation. I've done substantial tree harvesting on 150 acres of land to stimulate early successional habitat. I planted 3,000 trees specifically for grouse. I've purchased ruffed grouse from a licensed breeder so I could study the birds closer. I made a substantial investment in a large flight pen so I could study the birds in a more natural setting. I've spent countless hours throughout my life researching all aspects of ruffed grouse. I spent a lot of time communicating with many grouse biologists in many states. And everything I've done won't bring back grouse to where I live. They are locally extinct. So what else can be done? I continue to talk with people who are in charge of managing for ruffed grouse to see what new ideas they have. I hear a lot of the same. A chorus of wildlife managers have been and continue to say that we need more early successional high stem density habitat for grouse. They say grouse need lots of small diameter, dense new growth that is between 5 and 20 years old. This type of habitat typically grows following a significant alteration to the forest, tree harvesting. This habitat is great, and who would argue against having more habitat? I certainly wouldn't. However, that is not the habitat I grew up finding grouse in. As recently as the late 1980s, prime grouse habitat in parts of Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts were quite different than what wildlife managers tell us we need today if we hope to have ruffed grouse. The typical southern New England cover I found grouse in was more like a savanna or scrub pasture with scattered native shrubs, native blueberry bushes, native grasses, goldenrod, grapevine, staghorn sumac, small patches of green briar surrounding ledge outcroppings, with scattered common juniper bushes, and eastern red cedars. In this habitat, you could flush a covey of bobwhite and multiple ruffed grouse. The walking was easy, no need for brush pants. The birds were persistent year after year. Flushing a covey of quail and a half a dozen grouse in a couple of hours of hunting was reasonable, all the way into the late 80s. First, the quail disappeared, and by the end of the mid-90s, the grouse had become scarce. These covers were often just a few acres and separated by roads, pastures, mature woods, red maple wetlands, and residential properties. What's interesting about those covers is they were more productive over longer periods than the recommended prime habitat created by intensive forestry management. These covers produced for decades, instead of the 10 to 20 year window for optimum production in early successional habitat. The habitat matured much slower. The habitat and the grouse production was very consistent over 40 years. Possibly the soils just lended itself to slower growing shrubs and junipers, with an occasional malnourished, slow growing twisted oak or cherry. There's a classic grouse hunting book called New England Grouse Shooting. It's by William Harnden Foster. On page 18 of the preface, he describes the habitat where they hunted ruffed grouse as follows: the grouse of bayberry pastures and the junipers, where the alder runs continue down from the birch side hills that are dotted with white pines and cedars. And here and there is found a wild apple tree in the corner of an ancient stone wall, with blackberry vines and bullbriars tangled together and beneath. This sounds like the same habitat I found grouse in. It wasn't high stem density habitat. So the question I struggle with is this: why do grouse need that specific habitat now, but they didn't before? Something or some things must have changed. To understand what changed, I started at the beginning with colonization. I looked into what the habitat looked like in southern New England when the first colonists arrived. The earliest account I found was by John Smith, circa 1616. He reported the forest had massive, widely spaced trees, including oak and pine, which allowed easy travel. In 1634, William Wood described the forest as lacking underwood and rubbish. In fact, the woodland, by many accounts, was described as open and park-like, allowing for easy passage of horses and wagons, according to what Wood wrote in his 1634 account, New England's Prospect. Even science supports these accounts. Scientific research by some of the most reputable academics on this topic published their findings in 2018 in the Journal of Biogeography. Researchers from Harvard Forest analyzed sediment cores from New England lakes and ponds to reconstruct 14,000 years of landscape history. The study found through analyzing samples containing pollen that a dense, closed canopy hardwood forest dominated for thousands of years up until European arrival or colonization. The widespread theory that Native Americans cleared land through setting fires that would create early successional habitat was rare according to the core samples. A layer of charcoal or lack of charcoal shows how fire impacted the landscape. This research looked into the landscape of southern New England. It confirms the descriptions of the earliest accounts of the old-growth forests encountered by the first colonists. Now we have scientific evidence that corroborates the first-hand accounts and descriptions of what the habitat looked like in pre-colonial America. So to recap, in the 1600s to the 1980s, ruffed grouse lived in areas that were not characterized as high stem density habitat. We know that in colonial times, the woods were old-growth forests. Where's the proof grouse were in old-growth forests in southern New England? To understand if grouse existed in these old-growth forests, we rely on colonial diaries, records, and the book New English Canon, written in 1637 by noted attorney Thomas Morton, who wrote extensively about natural abundance. He wrote that he observed that there were multitudes of partridge in the woods around the settlement, noting they were so numerous and unafraid that they could be killed with a stick. Modern naturalists confirm that he was describing ruffed grouse. Here's how we know Morton was describing ruffed grouse and not the heath hen. Modern naturalists and historians prove Thomas Morton's partridge was a ruffed grouse and not a heath hen by a process of comparative morphology, physical traits, behavioral analysis, and habitat mapping. Morton provided specific morphology details. Size of a hen. The ruff Morton specifically refers to the ruffed feathers around the neck. Behavioral analysis. Perching in a tree when startled. Other early contemporaries of Morton described the drumming sound. Habitat mapping. Morton described them being in the woods and thickets. The only other bird that might fit the description of the size was the heath hen, but the heath hen preferred open, sandy barrens and grasslands, not woods. So to recap, we had an abundance of ruffed grouse in old-growth forests. How could that have been? So this brings up the question, why do we need specific early successional habitat that has high stem densities that are 5 years to 20 years old today if we want to have grouse? The answer is they need this specific habitat today to protect them from predators. While this habitat can provide food, grouse were always able to find food in a variety of conditions across the 38 states they were found in.
What predators kill the most grouse? I will answer that with data, research, and studies from respected wildlife agencies and wildlife managers. Grouse have many, but none have a greater impact than certain hawks. Hawks that primarily prey on other birds belong to a scientific group called accipiter. In North America, the three species that primarily feed on grouse are the Cooper's hawk, sharp-shinned hawk, and the goshawk. The goshawk was one of the key contributors in decimating a recovery effort of the heath hen on Martha's Vineyard, another ground-dwelling bird that's now extinct. How much damage could a pair of hawks really do to grouse? That's a great question. One of the longest-running, most credible studies on ruffed grouse is the Cloquet Forest Wildlife Project that ran for 32 years. It took place in Minnesota by a team of researchers and wildlife biologists, most notably Gordon Gullion, a professor of wildlife management known as Mr. Ruffed Grouse. During the early years of the study, 1958 through 1972, the hawks that most heavily prey upon grouse were well on their own path to extinction. During the years Gullion ran the Cloquet study, they had very few goshawks within the 3,400-acre study area. They had one nesting pair of goshawks. Gullion spent time understanding their impact on ruffed grouse. Here's a quote from Gullion's book, The Ruffed Grouse. You can find this quote on page 133. We believe that a pair of goshawks kill on the order of 270 to 315 ruffed grouse annually, end quote. Think about the consequences of that year after year for a moment. In the states of Connecticut and Rhode Island, we likely don't have a combined population of ruffed grouse that exceeds 300 birds today. Just one pair of goshawks could kill all of those birds in a year or less. On page 24 of the same book, Gullion writes, and I quote, "At Cloquet on May of 1978, we know that at least 11 banded ruffed grouse were brought to a nest containing 2 young goshawks over a 2-week period," end quote. Keep in mind, that was just 6 years after the Migratory Game Bird Treaty Act placed federal protection on all raptors. At that time, the population of raptors was extremely low, and Gullion, like Leopold before him, couldn't project and manage for a hypothetical situation that might occur decades later. That said, Gullion had the foresight to point out that goshawks will, and I quote, "kill whenever the opportunity occurs. If they don't eat the prey they kill, they may cache it for later on," end quote. You can find that quote in Gullion's book, The Ruffed Grouse, on page 133. Gullion used an interesting term in that book, circle of suppression, regarding the 1.25-mile area immediately surrounding a goshawk's nest. He discusses the high mortality rate in an area within 1.25 miles surrounding the nest. Grouse survival in this area could be measured in days, not weeks, and in the area beyond the 1.25 miles, it could face similar pressure depending on the availability of grouse. If you consider those damage estimates and the actual grouse mortality in just 1 month from one pair of goshawks on the Cloquet study, then you multiply the effect by the partners in flight estimates of the same grouse-eating species of hawks today. It becomes a matter of simple math to explain the grouse decline. Consider this example. Rhode Island contains 1,045 square miles. 55 to 60% of Rhode Island's total land is covered by forest, approximately 370,000 acres. 58% of that land is classified as core forest. Core forest may be described as interior, unfragmented land, typically at least 300 feet from land that isn't forest land. Lands that are more suitable for wildlife like ruffed grouse. Approximately 215,000 acres is core forest land in Rhode Island, if we round up. Now, wildlife biologist Gordon Gullion described a circle of suppression as being a 1.25-mile circle. A 1.25-mile circle contains approximately 3,142 acres. If you divide a single circle of suppression, 3,142, into 215,000 acres, you come up with slightly over 68 1.25-mile circles of suppression. If you take 68, the number that represents the circles of suppression, and multiply that by 2 hawks, you only need 136 hawks to decimate the ruffed grouse population in the entire state of Rhode Island. 136 hawks is just a tiny percentage of the estimated 200,000 goshawks, 800,000 Cooper's hawks, and 400,000 sharp-shinned hawks in North America. That's 1.4 million predators killing grouse at will all year round, with no limit on how many they kill. This isn't even part of the conversation why grouse are vanishing from the land. I believe the surge in specific populations of hawks that eat grouse have caused the circles of suppression to overlap one another, blanketing first the hawks' wintering migratory grounds at the southern extreme of the ruffed grouse's historical range, then gradually tightening the noose, moving northward back towards the hawk's spring and summer range. While there are many predators that kill grouse, raptors, hawks and owls kill the vast majority, over 75%. Ing and Gullion supplied an interesting table documenting ruffed grouse losses on the Cloquet Forest Research Center between 1956 and 1961. Of the 232 grouse that were killed, 15 were roadkills, 16 were killed by hunters, 3 by bobcats, 10 by foxes, and 134 killed by hawks and owls. The remaining 54 kills died from unknown causes. If you start with 232 dead grouse and you subtract out 54 grouse that were killed from unknown causes, you have 178 identifiable kills. Of the 178 dead grouse, 134 were killed by hawks and owls. For those that like numbers, that's 75% of the predator kills were from hawks and owls. with goshawks making up the majority of the kills. Not all raptors have the same killing capacity. The Cooper's hawk may be the most damaging due to its speed, agility, techniques, appetite for killing, and the sheer population size. Partners in Flight is a respected collaborative network that collects data on a variety of wild birds. They estimate that the Cooper's hawk has a breeding population as high as 800,000 birds. To better understand how this impacts ruffed grouse, it's important to know a few things about the Cooper's hawk. They are one of the primary predators of ruffed grouse and a key contributor to grouse mortality in the fall and winter months, the seasons when grouse are most vulnerable. According to Hawk Mountain Global Raptor Conservation website, the Cooper's hawk cruises through the low understory of the woods at 40 to 50 miles per hour, reaching speeds of 60 miles per hour when in pursuit of game. They are adept ground hunters pursuing game on foot into brush when they can't attack from the air. Cooper's hawks and goshawks are opportunistic, with the bloodlust of a weasel. They kill as much game as they can find, often eating only small portions of their total kill. I will never understand why killing weasels that kill your domestic fowl is unregulated, but killing another creature that happens to have wings in a burgeoning population will get you a $15,000 fine and/or 6 months in prison. Both creatures are bloodthirsty killers that damage domestic fowl and valuable wild game. The ruffed grouse can escape the weasel, but it doesn't win very often against a hawk. Ruffed grouse cruise at half the speed of a Cooper's hawk. They can't outmaneuver a Cooper's hawk. They can try to hide, but only as long as the Cooper's hawk isn't in the mood to pursue them on the ground. At some point, the grouse will emerge from the cover to fly up into the canopy of trees, either to roost or feed on buds, catkins, or leaves on the treetops. Then the Cooper's hawk has every advantage. The grouse lose in the majority of cases. It's not just the mortality brought on by Cooper's hawks. It's the collective effect of several hawk species. Their impact on grouse have either been overlooked, underpublished, or quietly suppressed. The evidence of their potential damage on grouse is available if you look for it. Ask yourself this: what's the cumulative effect of 800,000 Cooper's hawks, 200,000 goshawks, 400,000 sharp-shinned hawks, 3.5 million barred owls, 4 million great horned owls? And these estimates by Partners in Flight are likely conservative. The answer can only be catastrophic decline in the grouse population, exactly what we are experiencing. Keep in mind, these raptors don't have a legal limit on how many grouse they can kill or a season that controls when they hunt. Didn't grouse co-evolve with these predators? Co-evolve they did. But again, the circumstances were very different throughout time. Two questions come to mind. If these hawks are so damaging to grouse, how is it that grouse survived so long? And how could ruffed grouse have been in great numbers in old-growth forests, like the colonists described, where they would have very little, if any, cover to hide in? My answer to these questions is just my opinion, my hypothesis, you could say. This is something that I've never heard from anyone else, and I've never read anywhere, but it's the only conclusion that can explain how ruffed grouse survive this long and how colonists could have found ruffed grouse in great numbers in old-growth forests. The only plausible answer is there had to have been an abundance of alternative bird species, or a keystone species that these hawks preferred in the same geographic area that ruffed grouse inhabited. But if that was the case, then why don't the hawks continue to prey on that other species today? Unless that species went extinct, two possible species need to be considered. Both could have shielded the ruffed grouse from these hawks: the heath hen and the passenger pigeon, both of which are extinct today. The passenger pigeon is the one that makes the most sense, as it was truly a keystone species that existed in the old-growth woods in colonial America. As many as 5 billion passenger pigeons fed on the forest floor and roosted in old-growth trees. Ornithologists estimate the population represented as much as 40% of the entire North American bird population. Think about that for a moment. 40% of the entire North American bird population. The bird-eating hawk's migration was synchronized with the migration of the passenger pigeon from north to south.
The hawks raised their young on passenger pigeons, and as the pigeons migrated south, so did the hawks. These passenger pigeons were abundant and a lower risk than going after a crafty grouse. Grouse didn't need to be on the menu. Year after year of young hawks grew up eating passenger pigeon. That was what they knew, and just like in fishing, critters eat what they know. In fishing, there's an old saying that says you have to match the hatch if you want to catch a fish. The same concept holds true with hawks. With the extinction of passenger pigeons in the late 1800s and the shooting of hawks, the inevitable collapse of the grouse population was delayed. The golden age for ruffed grouse would continue long enough for the primary predator of ruffed grouse to recover and experience a population spike. As long as hawks had passenger pigeons, they were satisfied. Predator satiation was in play. Predator satiation is an evolutionary adaptation in which prey species occur in such high population densities it overwhelms the ability of predators to consume them. Essentially, hawks were more than satisfied killing passenger pigeons, so grouse were shielded and weren't threatened. But the passenger pigeons have been extinct for over 100 years. If these certain hawks were the problem, then why did it take them until the last few decades to become a problem for grouse? That's a great question. The last great flocks of passenger pigeons were gone by the 1890s. People in that period had cleared virtually all of the land of woods, from the Atlantic to the mountains in New England, for agriculture. Hawks had very few roost trees, but barn roofs provided alternative roosts, and chickens were always available around farms. Farmers prioritized shooting hawks, and because almost everyone was a farmer, lots of hawks were getting killed off each and every year. According to Birds of North America, the following citation puts it into perspective how many hawks were removed. Banding data from the 1930s and 40s found that in certain regions of the United States, as many as 47% of Cooper's hawks were shot in their first year. Many states paid a bounty for specific hawks that preyed upon chickens and game birds like ruffed grouse. That's a citation from Mueller, Berger, and Gladding. Then the chemical DDT came onto the landscape, and this further suppressed the hawk population. Grouse managed to thrive in the worst fragmented habitat in history, and in old-growth forests provided hawks had a keystone food source like passenger pigeons, or the hawk population was managed to prevent excessive predation. Even on a landscape that had almost all of its woodlands converted into sheep pastures. That is a level of habitat fragmentation that exceeds anything we have today. But the grouse survived then, where they have gone locally extinct today. My own farm is a perfect example. I have the first aerial photos showing the landscape first in the 1930s, then again in the 1950s. And when I compare it to today, the cover is far better today than in earlier aerial photos. But today, no wild grouse exist on this land. But prior to the 1990s, the grouse were always here in good numbers. So how, when, and why did the focus change from predator management to the singular focus of wildlife managers on habitat? The change in focus from predator management to habitat management for ruffed grouse came from an individual with a Master of Forestry degree from Yale, Aldo Leopold. Leopold argued in his 1933 book, Game Management, that habitat was the true governing factor of ruffed grouse, not predation. Prior to Leopold, the best management practices for improving grouse had a heavy emphasis on managing predation, a lesson learned from centuries of game management in the Old World, in Europe. The game managers before Leopold's time were not wrong. They were managing the circumstances they experienced. As circumstances change, so must the management. A failure to adapt is a decision to fail. Leopold is a man I have the utmost respect for. I don't think he was wrong with his case for habitat. To fully understand Leopold's thinking, the context is critical. Leopold was making management recommendations to address the newly identified 10-year cycle in ruffed grouse populations in a specific region during a specific time period with specific conditions in the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and Ohio. Today, circumstances to the south and east of these states are very different from the controlling factors that Leopold was managing for. Leopold had a landscape that had very little cover left, but also had very few hawks, so predation wasn't a likely culprit for the downturns in the ruffed grouse cycle. Leopold's observations and recommendations became doctrine. Every university grooming future generations of wildlife biologists to this day embraced his directive as if it came from God himself. So habitat, and more habitat is the only solution being considered for saving ruffed grouse. Almost 100 years later, after Leopold made his case for habitat, wildlife managers are still taught that only through specific habitat management can ruffed grouse remain at healthy population levels. And to think anything other than that is not up for discussion. Grouse biologists have been indoctrinated to believe grouse mortality is primarily controlled by the availability of specific early successional high stem density habitat. The saying goes that where you find the habitat, you find birds. If you find the habitat and you don't find birds, well, you will be told that's because of habitat fragmentation.
The last 60 years of ruffed grouse management is based on the belief that the only way ruffed grouse can survive is if they hide, and to do that, they need very specific habitat. With that thinking, the focus on creating a specific type of habitat has been the only real mechanism used to increase the grouse population. Meanwhile, grouse numbers have steadily declined, despite decades of state, federal, private, and public participation totaling millions of dollars annually, with a single focus being on Leopold's directive. Focus on habitat. The grouse population is plummeting. It's in a free fall. Our game managers are still screaming, "Create more habitat. It's the only way out of this." They are preaching what they were taught in the policy that's politically accepted. This habitat isn't effective because ruffed grouse spend a great deal of their time roosting in trees and feeding in treetops. They simply can't hide in early successional, high stem density habitat long enough to save the species. That isn't conjecture, that's self-evident. Furthermore, male grouse are easy targets that announce their location when they sound off with their territorial drumming call from elevated stumps, logs, and boulders in locations that give the male grouse an open view of their surroundings. This makes them easy to find and easy to kill for hawks. One of the most respected and all-encompassing studies on ruffed grouse was conducted in the 1930s by New York State by Gardiner Bump and colleagues. They spent 13 years studying all aspects of grouse. In the book, The Ruffed Grouse, Life History, Propagation, and Management, you will find one particular excerpt that sets a benchmark that all wildlife managers should be held to. It says, and I quote, "One of the principal measures of worth of a game management program is its effectiveness in increasing the density of such species as well as reducing the frequency and severity of scarcity." End quote. Page 521, you'll find that quote on. If you evaluate the last several decades of game management success on increasing the density of ruffed grouse and reducing the scarcity of ruffed grouse across their historical range based on the measure of worth from Gardiner Bump's book, it's been a failure. The only thing worse than denying that is continuing to advocate for more of the same. Changing that paradigm could take decades. We don't have a decade at the current rate of decline. Habitat will continue to play a vital role in the future of grouse, but the narrow focus on habitat alone as the only mechanism to manage for grouse needs to be re-examined. More of the same management may not be directly responsible for the declines, but it has not proven to prevent or slow the declines across ruffed grouse's historical range. It's long overdue to objectively evaluate the conservation measures that have been used. I believe the best way to help ruffed grouse is to modify the management recommendations.
We are not going to out-habitat this problem. It hasn't worked in the previous decades, and it's not going to work in the future as long as it's the singular focus of our state and federal resources. Today, you have an explosion in the population of the most aggressive accipiters that hunt ruffed grouse, a missing keystone species, the passenger pigeon, and nothing suppressing the desire of accipiters' bloodlust. This is why we are seeing unprecedented declines in the breeding population of grouse for many decades. As the geography that grouse occupy shrinks from the south to the north, the concentration of accipiters in the fall and winter increases from the south to the north, tightening the proverbial noose on the remaining population. The hawks that migrated furthest south find less grouse in the southern extremes of the ruffed grouse's range, so they hunt their way back north, converging as they locate pockets of the remaining grouse. These pockets are hunted until the grouse are no longer available. You don't leave food to find food. If any grouse survive the onslaught, you have to hope for a dry spring without West Nile virus. Even with the average mortality of breeding adults, it could take just 1 or 2 years with no young for the majority of all ruffed grouse to be extirpated by the burgeoning accipiter population. The decline of ruffed grouse has accelerated across the majority of the species' historical range within the continental United States, despite the best of intentions of decades of ruffed grouse managers' single focus on creating prime, early, successional, high stem density habitat as the only acceptable method to stabilize and grow the ruffed grouse population.
Since the Pittman-Robertson Act in 1937, $29 billion has been spent on wildlife restoration. A significant portion of the $29 billion has been spent restoring early successional habitat. The onset of the decline started in the southern and central areas of the ruffed grouse's native range. More recently, the decline has progressed into the northern states that traditionally held the highest populations of grouse. In New York State, populations of 12 birds per 100 acres, and in some cases as many as 20 birds per 100 acres, could be expected in the 1930s. These estimates come from Gardiner in his book Ruffed Grouse, Life History, Propagation, and Management on page 520. Today, none of these covers have grouse in densities even approaching the lower estimates of Bump's birds per acre. When someone makes the statement that where you find cover, implying early successional high stem density cover, you still find birds, that is not an acceptable measure of success. Simply finding birds when everything is near ideal in the northern parts of the ruffed grouse's historical range is not a barometer for the species at large. Entire states have areas of heavily managed prime habitat but have no birds left. In these northern covers, finding a few birds in prime habitat where you could be finding 20 birds per 100 acres exemplifies the point that the birds are in a free fall decline across their range. Hunters today suffer from recency bias, thinking that if they see a few birds after working prime cover with well-trained bird dogs, that indicates the bird numbers are healthy or stable. Since 1960, according to the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation website, ruffed grouse have declined by 80% since 1960. That's alarming. We have a serious problem that requires serious conversations followed by timely action. Why aren't our wildlife managers doing anything about the hawk and other accipiter problem? That's a good question. The answer is complicated. I can only speculate. Based on what I've read and been told, the group thinking points to habitat first and then predator regimes, which is buried in a list of other potential causes of the declining population of ruffed grouse. Predator regimes is vague and non-specific, and that's a big part of the problem. These wildlife managers manage based on the science. Management follows the science. Managers might know that we have a massive avian predator problem, but they don't have the peer-reviewed science to do anything about it. Meaningful changes often require difficult conversations. Decreasing certain hawk and owl populations is a difficult conversation, and several considerations must be considered. Self-preservation, political fallout, and even the threat to one's employment. It's also likely they don't believe that there's any chance of getting certain accipiters removed from the Migratory Bird Treaty Act.
If you so much as suggest managing any accipiters whose populations have exceeded the carrying capacity of the prey species they predominantly feed on, you will be told in no certain order the following things. Just because we have really healthy populations of accipiters that are the primary predators driving adult grouse mortality doesn't mean grouse can't survive if the habitat is right. Then you will get, as you know, correlation doesn't always equal causation. No, but more often than not it does. which is why every investigation relies so heavily on that method. The scientific method places significant value on correlation. In the hierarchy of scientific evidence, correlation is the smoke that leads scientists to look for the fire, causation. You will also hear the species co-evolved, so grouse and raptors have always had this feast-to-famine relationship. This I totally disagree with. Since accipiter numbers were suppressed for the better part of a century, and before that they had passenger pigeons numbering in the billions to feast on. Then you will hear any reduction efforts aimed at reducing the number of hawks won't happen, because in order to do that, you would have to get the federal government to issue a special purpose permit under the MBTA, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and that won't happen. But it has and does happen. Most recently, the barred owl was deemed a threat to the endangered northern spotted owl, and a special purpose permit was issued to reduce their population by 450,000. As Leopold's initial emphasis on predator management evolved into a focus on habitat management, it's important to understand there were a few things in play. First, the primary avian predators of grouse had been driven to near extinction, so their impact on grouse mortality was negligible to Leopold. Accipiters weren't protected until 1972. DDT had really depleted the remaining population of specific raptors, including accipiters, giving the grouse a major survival advantage. With these circumstances, any focus on improving habitat was certainly going to be validated by increased numbers of grouse, so long as their predation stayed low. If any declines in grouse occurred, it could continue to be attributed to the mysterious 10-year cycle the birds experience, or development encroaching on the rural countryside. As grouse numbers began to decline after the protection of raptors in 1972, a new concept was introduced called habitat fragmentation. This is used to explain why no grouse are found in many areas, even when prime habitat exists. All of these reasons are plausible, even if they aren't always accurate. The problem with providing a lengthy list of possible causes is it can complicate the process of determining the greatest threats, diluting and even masking a greater problem within the list of potential causes of the decline. Only through time would we find out that habitat management alone hasn't increased the grouse population. Habitat fragmentation may have its merits in certain highly isolated pockets of habitat that become completely isolated due to large-scale, rapid onset of development. But as a regional explanation, it makes little sense. Any student of history knows that modern habitat fragmentation pales in comparison to the total clear-cutting and land conversion of the mid to the late 1800s. New England experienced peak deforestation during these years, with the land being converted to open farmland from the Atlantic Ocean inland and up into the mountains. The forest was clear-cut and converted into grazed sheep pasture. Any remaining habitat then was certainly fragmented more at that time than today. It must be considered that the conservation efforts that focus on creating prime high stem density habitat also create fragmentation if you subscribe to the theory that grouse need this specific habitat to survive it. If that is in fact the case, then everything outside of the specific habitat is a desert to the ruffed grouse. All of these reasons have created a buffer that has taken the pressure off game managers for decades to show a return on investment made in creating habitat. Leopold's recommendations were prudent for the time, conditions, and place where he conducted his research. Predation from accipiters was not a problem he had to manage around, but the decades that followed would lead to the federal protection of all raptors, including accipiters, with the implementation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, MBTA. In 1972, all raptors were given protection under the MBTA. It would take a decade or two for raptors to recover, and now some, including the Cooper's hawk and the sharp-shinned hawk, have exploding populations. I think it's interesting that it's socially acceptable to say we have too many deer, but to say we have too many hawks is akin to high treason. Today, the greatest cause of mortality with adult ruffed grouse is directly linked to specific hawks that in Leopold's time didn't have a significant impact on the general population of ruffed grouse. Nature doesn't operate in a vacuum. Things change, and when things change, the management must change too. I'd like to introduce an alternative management plan, a more targeted, holistic management initiative that will bring ruffed grouse into full recovery. While habitat work is essential and must continue, it won't replace birds where they are locally extinct. Ruffed grouse don't migrate, so if they are locally extinct, the only chance of a recovery is through human intervention in the form of relocations or releasing captive raised birds. The decades-long singular focus on specific age class of habitat hasn't proven to decrease predation enough to offset the annual mortality, and it doesn't offer a sustainable solution for most of the ruffed grouse's range. Too much of the range is in private land ownership, and that lends itself to continued fragmentation over the majority of the landscape, and the exhaustive measures needed to create very specific regimented commercial tree harvesting practices required to provide a very niche type of 5 to 20-year-old early successional habitat isn't practical in most of the ruffed grouse's 38-state historical range. The exception being commercial forestry lands where large corporate landowners control massive tracts of land for industrial forestry purposes. These commercial businesses, produce the necessary early successional habitat as a byproduct without guidance from wildlife managers. So this is an area that needs very little direction insofar as habitat management for ruffed grouse. Ruffed grouse need to be managed holistically. The single focus on habitat management has not proven successful. Emphasis needs to be focused but diversified on other active management strategies. Foremost is decreasing adult breeding population mortality through policy changes that allow for targeted predator management, more extensive directed West Nile virus research, modified habitat initiatives, restocking programs, a captive breeding program that focuses on preserving subspecies, and education. Through a holistic approach, ruffed grouse will recover.
A holistic approach to active management for ruffed grouse. Decreasing mortality. This could be accomplished several ways. Raptor management needs to become the central focus of a predator management program for ruffed grouse. It's possible that the current administration will look at the preponderance of prevailing evidence and the population size of certain raptors, like the Cooper's hawk, and issue a special purpose permit, similar to what was recently done with the barred owl. Time is of the essence for two reasons. The grouse can't afford to wait, and we can't afford to miss the opportunity we have with this administration. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act was created in 1918. In 1972, all raptors, including hawks and owls, were protected. That was over 50 years ago. A lot has changed. I believe it's long overdue that some of these species have their protected status removed. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act needs to have a streamlined evaluation and auditing process to remove the protected status of certain species. Some of these international agreements become a hindrance to timely management of species and require too much political wrangling, to the detriment of prey species like ruffed grouse. State wildlife agencies could look at the severity of the grouse decline and develop projections that illustrate the mortality of the remaining ruffed grouse populations based on specific predator populations and their known impact on ruffed grouse. Painting in broad brushstrokes and using words like predator regimes is so non-specific it becomes impossible to manage. Agencies could develop a forecast to help predict consequences of an expanding raptor population. That could allow for a softening of restrictions for landowners who are in certain businesses that suffer from unmitigated predation, like farmers and licensed game bird breeders. State agencies could work to develop a corps of citizen scientists to conduct a comprehensive count of avian predators and ruffed grouse. The data on hawks is already being gathered by volunteers, citizen scientists. It simply needs to be collated into a central database. Biologists say that getting accurate population surveys on ruffed grouse is cryptic and difficult to survey. If citizen scientists were recruited from the corps of hunters and pointing dog clubs to survey ruffed grouse in the month of March, after hunting season but just before breeding season, more accurate population surveys could be available. The data could be used to lobby the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to relax restrictions on certain raptors like the Cooper's hawk and sharp-shinned hawk. West Nile virus. Increasing federal resources to fund more research on West Nile virus. The Pennsylvania Game Commission study by ruffed grouse biologist Lisa Williams revealed that only about 10% of the infected chicks survive. At this point, producing as many chicks as possible is the only way to ensure a future. And we have no future if the raptors have decimated the adult bird breeding population before spring. The northern and southern house mosquito that are the primary transmitters of West Nile virus need to be targeted through genetic tools, regulated biopesticides, and even more conventional mechanical methods like draining certain reproduction locations. Modify the approach to habitat management. Rather than a blanket approach to a specific age class of habitat, a more diversified regional approach that utilizes more sustainable types of habitat creation could be encouraged. One example could be to encourage and offer federal assistance to plant evergreens and shrub species like common shrub juniper that provide year-round cover. Evergreens and evergreen shrubs create habitat that is longer lasting than more traditional deciduous, high stem density regrowth that follows intensive forestry management. And evergreens give concealment at the most vulnerable time of the year, the winter, when the mortality of grouse is at its peak from avian predators. In my half-acre research flight pen, the highest use areas change with the season. From November through April, the common shrub junipers are the only habitat utilized. Evergreens may be the best habitat shield for ruffed grouse. Ruffed grouse populations are most stable in the boreal forests in northern Canada. Boreal forests are primarily conifers, evergreen forests. Evergreens provide thermal cover in the winter, and they make it more difficult for hawks and owls to locate ruffed grouse. A new type of conservation reserve program could be promoted to encourage eastern farmers to keep edge buffers between crop fields and forests, leaving fence lines unmowed through the winter and removal of roost trees from the fence lines and hedgerows while promoting brush species like common shrub juniper. Farmers would embrace schemes that paid for the removal of trees around their fields, fences, and other financial assistance if they agree to encourage brush in these low-quality edges and not spray it. Discourage forestry management practices that leave roost trees for hawks and owls. Regenerating clear cuts provide more even, early successional habitat for grouse and higher quality timber than alternative methods. Encourage timber harvests that leave loose brush piles near the edge of cuts. These brush piles provide excellent habitat for many prey species, including grouse. In certain places, nursery plots could be identified, enhanced, and protected to ensure the legacy of ruffed grouse in an area. This would give a maximum protection to select pockets across and throughout the ruffed grouse's historical range.
Restocking. Restocking has to become a priority. Grouse don't migrate, and where they are locally extinct, they will need to be restocked with either captured wild birds from other locations and or captured raised birds. Gardiner Bump supported restocking with captive raised birds. Information regarding that can be found on page 503 of the book, The Ruffed Grouse, Life History, Propagation, and Management. In January of 2009, the American Midland Naturalist featured an article, Raising and Monitoring Tame Ruffed Grouse for Field Studies by Peter Sharp, Alan Wolfe, and Daniel Roby. These authors established the tame ruffed grouse released into the wild use the same cover and food sources of the wild ruffed grouse. The survivability varied depending on the circumstances of the release. They released a total of 10 tame ruffed grouse. 6 of the 10 birds were released in February of 1990. Of those birds, 5 survived and were monitored from February of 1990 to March of 1991. This is in line with the average lifespan of wild ruffed grouse. Relying on states to allocate financial resources to raising grouse in captivity for the purposes of restocking hasn't been done since the 1930s. One of the major challenges has been raising the ruffed grouse in large flight pens on the ground. They do fine off the ground on wire with the right care, but they die quickly on the ground, and the reasons haven't been fully identified. Without the ability to raise ruffed grouse in large flight pens on the ground, it becomes impractical to construct enough wire floor raised pens to raise enough birds to release. By supporting private citizens' ability to raise ruffed grouse, the process of trial and error at the cost of the private citizen is the most likely path to cracking the code on raising ruffed grouse in large numbers on the ground, which is a critical hurdle to overcome if restocking is to become economically and numerically viable.
Insurance, private game bird production, and protecting the genetic subspecies. Artificial propagation must be encouraged to prevent a scenario like the attempts to save the heath hen and passenger pigeon. In both cases, little was known about raising these birds in captivity. By the time efforts were made, it was a steep learning curve. Too little, too late, and we lost both species to extinction. If we had more captive flocks and time, both of the extinctions could have been prevented. States that still have stable populations of ruffed grouse could fast-track collection permits, authorizing licensed game bird breeders to live trap birds for breeding purposes or collect eggs. As it stands now, these collection permits are usually only granted for education and science experiments by accredited institutions. That's too limiting and unnecessary. Think about this. Bobwhite quail are another native bird. These birds are raised successfully in captivity by the millions. It's illogical when you think about this. A hunter can buy a license and hunt ruffed grouse for a 3-month season, shooting up to 4 grouse a day in certain states like Vermont and Maine. But if a licensed game bird breeder wants permission to catch just one bird or to gather some eggs to add new genetics to their permitted flock of ruffed grouse, they are stonewalled. This process should be simplified. If you are a permitted game bird breeder, you could be allowed to purchase a separate license for a live capture or for egg gathering for a fee. With somewhere between 13 and 15 subspecies of ruffed grouse, captive flocks can serve as a genetic insurance policy, a type of repository, if you will, to pull from in the future when needed if the collection permits are made more readily available. Preserving the different subspecies may be more important than just focusing on genetic diversity in a specific region. Regional adaptations of subspecies may be crucial to restocking in the future. Captive flocks can be used for testing and controlled experiments for viruses and diseases. Had it not been for Pennsylvania Game Commission biologist Lisa Williams finding Dan and Celine Snyder, the effects of West Nile virus on ruffed grouse may not have been realized. The Snyders are private licensed grouse breeders with extensive experience raising ruffed grouse in captivity. The Snyders were able to hatch and raise the young grouse from the eggs that the biologists gathered in the wild. This is just one example of the many benefits of having a licensed game bird breeder raising ruffed grouse.
Education. The future of ruffed grouse will be dictated by the actions or inactions of our future wildlife managers, politicians, and the informed public. We have to get our educators and academics to encourage independent thinking, recognize historical context for what it is and isn't, proactive management, encouraging management that looks holistically at a problem and identifies the evolution of variables that require changing management initiatives at a scale and time that yields measurable, desirable results. The ruffed grouse need our help now. New eyes, new ideas, and additional conservation measures will be their best chance for recovery. Habitat management is important, but not at the expense of a holistic management strategy that increases resources across a variety of targeted management goals. Humans have a role and responsibility. We created the problem beginning with the extermination of the passenger pigeon. Then, through the continued protection of certain accipiters, despite their population size exceeding sustainable levels, then the accidental introduction of West Nile virus in 1999, and the failure to react in a timely way to changing environmental circumstances through adjusted management strategies.
Ruffed grouse are in a prolonged, serious decline with no signs of recovery. In fact, the pace of the decline is increasing, despite decades of conservation efforts focused on increasing habitat. Across much of the historical range, ruffed grouse are missing from the landscape, leaving wildlife managers calling them regionally extirpated or locally extinct. One thing is clear: 18 states have completely eliminated the hunting season for them, and more states are preparing to follow. We have a serious problem. I have never experienced this species' path to extinction, but I have read extensively about it. The path ruffed grouse are on is trending in the wrong direction. I don't believe we have a lot of time left to turn things around. You can help by sharing this with other people who want to save ruffed grouse. Just by being informed, you can change the narrative about the cause of the plight of ruffed grouse. Push for a more robust, holistic management program. Know the science, the studies, the data on grouse mortality. Ask the tough questions. Ask for the evidence that shows the millions spent annually on habitat work, year after year, for decades, has increased the grouse population throughout their historical range. It hasn't. Remember the words of one of the most respected ruffed grouse researchers and state biologist, New York State Superintendent of Game, Gardiner Bump. Gardiner said, and I quote, "One of the principal measures of worth of a game management program is its effectiveness in creating density of such species, as well as reducing the frequency and the severity of periods of scarcity." End quote. That is accountability, a method to measure wildlife managers' decisions on ruffed grouse management. You can get creative, write thoughtful letters to politicians, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and request action on removing the unnecessary protected status on certain accipiters like the Cooper's hawk. The question of how many grouse-eating hawks like the Cooper's hawk is too many. This needs to be answered if we have any hope of preserving ruffed grouse for future generations. The politics governing predator management will be the most important management tool in deciding the fate of ruffed grouse. The science shows that specific predators and West Nile virus are to blame for the massive decline in ruffed grouse. Evidence is available to support that predation-related mortality is primarily from specific accipiters like the goshawk, Cooper's hawk, and sharp-shinned hawk. Earlier I mentioned I have a captive, licensed, and permitted flock of ruffed grouse. I wanted to test my theory. My experience with raising ruffed grouse in a large outdoor flight pen where I control the habitat, supplemental food, shelter, and security, and minimize predation, but I have no control over the effects of weather or losses from West Nile virus. This research I've done has revealed some interesting data. My initial goal was to run a one-year test to establish the mortality rates of ruffed grouse if I provided protection against predators. So basically, I'm trying to see how many grouse I can keep alive, even with West Nile virus in my area, and testing if I can keep them alive on the ground, not on wire. This has been a challenge that's been going on for, since the 1930s and probably earlier. No one's been able to effectively raise them in any number on the ground successfully, to my knowledge. To test this, I needed to construct an outdoor habitat. This involved creating a half-acre raised earthen pad that was then landscaped with a variety of native plants, then constructing a fully enclosed flight pen or aviary. The objective was to provide a natural setting with full exposure to the weather, but minimizing predation. To do that, the flight pen has driven vertical posts with 1-inch mesh galvanized and vinyl-coated wire that is buried below grade 2 feet and extends approximately 8 feet above grade, where it is attached to the flexible mesh flight pen netting that covers the pen from sidewall to sidewall. A 3-foot tall visual barrier surrounds the flight pen at ground level to reduce stress on the grouse from ground traveling predators. Along the exterior of the flight pen, a single electrified wire was installed just a few feet off the ground to prevent predators from climbing the wire walls. In 1 year, I have lost 27.7% of the total population. Now, as a point of reference, in the wild, 60 to 70% of ruffed grouse die in their first year. And to my knowledge, ruffed grouse have never been successfully raised for extended periods of time on the ground. They die off quickly unless they are raised off the ground on wire. The flight pen is covered with netting that provides the maximum protection against avian predators. But even with that, 60% of the mortality came from avian predators. Within the flight pen, the grouse roost in trees and on structures that are made for roosting poles. The avian predators learn that the flight netting is soft and flexible enough that they can hit the netting above a roosting grouse, and the netting flexes downward enough to allow the hawk or owl to kill the grouse with its talons. The remaining 40% of the grouse mortality was lost to mixed circumstances, everything from collisions with structures within the flight pen to non-specific losses. One example was a bird that appeared lethargic but appeared in good physical condition. Full-breasted, good feathering, generally healthy with no physical damage. The bird died within a few days and it was sent out for pathology. It came back negative for avian influenza, which I didn't suspect, but it's a mandatory test that the state requires if you drop an animal off at pathology. The bird did have some cecal eggs in the necropsy report. Cecal worms carry blackhead disease, and these worms are, all over in the environment. So you're not going to eliminate them. You can treat birds for worms if you suspect that, but you'll never eliminate them. But there wasn't enough in there in terms of cecal worms to say that was the reason for the bird's death. The bird died during some extreme weather, and its death may have been related to a combination of circumstances. Now, West Nile virus was not suspected due to the time of year and the symptoms. Coccidiosis was not likely due to the protocol I have in place to manage for that one disease. This disease is not a measurable factor of mortality in wild populations where birds are less likely to ingest fecal matter. This is a success story, as raising grouse on the ground has stymied the best of efforts for years, including Gardiner Bump, who hatched and raised one shy of 2,000 grouse in his 13-year study at the New York State facility. Bump couldn't keep grouse alive unless they were raised on wire. Coccidiosis was identified as one of the major problems. It was not the only factor, though. I wouldn't say my experiment has cracked the code on raising ruffed grouse in a large flight pen on the ground, but it's certainly moving in the right direction. This matters because if we ever need to rely on pen-reared ruffed grouse to restock areas, we will need large numbers of birds. The only viable way to raise enough birds is in a large flight pen on the ground. One interesting observation that I found has to do with the difference in breeding habits of the red-phased ruffed grouse compared to the silver-phased ruffed grouse. The red-phased grouse will start breeding significantly earlier, typically 10 to 11 days earlier in the spring than the silver-phased birds. And the red-phased grouse will remain receptive to breeding later into the spring, by 7 to as much as 10 days later. The significantly longer breeding window could make the red-phased ruffed grouse better suited to adapt to erratic spring conditions. Breeding earlier is an advantage for a couple reasons. It prolongs the breeding window, creating more opportunities for a receptive female to meet a willing male. Also, chicks born earlier in unseasonably warm weather potentially have the advantage heading into colder weather, as they could be weeks older than young-of-the-year birds born to silver-phased parents. Another key advantage is the red-phased grouse's willingness to breed later into the spring. This could be valuable to reproduction when a female loses her first clutch of eggs. A female grouse is more likely to find a willing male if she has a red-phased male in an area, as he will still be looking to breed when the silver-phased males have begun molting and have lost their drive to breed. I've witnessed this pattern year after year. I shared my observations with another breeder who has many more years' experience raising ruffed grouse, and they have experienced the same pattern, even though they live in a very different climate. In my experience, the red-phased grouse are more aggressive breeders, with a longer breeding window. In the half-acre flight pen I have, the red-phased males will also end up winning the choice real estate. They tend to be more dominant. Due to the hyperactive breeding drive, red-phased males have proven to be more susceptible to stress-related deaths during the long breeding season. All of this proves to be even more interesting when you factor in that ruffed grouse don't always breed true to their color phases. Silver-phased parents possess recessive genes that throw other color phases, including the red phase. And the red phase grouse will often have young that possess the color phases, including silver and other phases. Having the grouse on the ground in a large flight pen created so many learning opportunities. I found that a volunteer plant, an invasive weed actually, provides an alternative seasonal source for cover and a high protein food for grouse. The plant is invasive mugwort. The grouse seem to readily consume the young foliage. What's really interesting about mugwort is that it provides a crude protein similar to white clover. Protein is essential to the health of grouse. Clover is known to be a preferred food of ruffed grouse and an important source of protein. Foraging for clover on roadsides exposes grouse to predation, as clover is a low-growing plant that provides very little cover. Mugwort, on the other hand, has the added benefit over clover by providing cover. It grows into a dense, chest-high closed canopy, providing safety for young grouse to forage in. That said, it's an invasive, and I'm not advocating for the proliferation of this plant. I'm simply pointing out that grouse value it. This experiment also confirmed that highest grouse mortality came from avian predators, even with a full canopy of flight netting over the aviary. Not disease, not West Nile virus, even though it was in the area, not extreme weather, even though we had one of the worst winters on record, and not because of the lack of high stem density habitat. Grouse thrived in old growth forests before we were on the continent. They can thrive again if we manage the primary avian predators that are overpopulated and are relentlessly killing ruffed grouse, fast-tracking them towards extinction. It's that simple. But the longer we allow wildlife managers to control the conversation and to continue to push the habitat, and more habitat story, the further we are from having any hope of seeing ruffed grouse recover. I fully support the efforts to continue to create certain types of early successional habitat, but that is not the controlling factor. The data and evidence I've supplied in this video substantiate the argument that habitat is not the main controlling factor for ruffed grouse. Here are the takeaways. Today, ruffed grouse are locally extinct in many parts of their historical range, despite decades of habitat work, millions spent annually on creating this early successional habitat. In all 38 states that make up the ruffed grouse's historical range, the grouse are declining. Grouse can be raised in numbers in captivity and be used for restocking, research, and to preserve the species. Where grouse are locally extinct, they will not return without our help. Grouse don't migrate. Captive raised grouse provide the only economical way to restock areas where grouse are locally extinct. Science and historical records prove that old growth forests supported prolific populations of ruffed grouse. The keystone species we call the passenger pigeon shielded ruffed grouse and other ground-dwelling birds from the onslaught of destructive avian predators. Decades of focus on creating early successional habitat hasn't replaced the shield that passenger pigeons provided. Scientific studies indicate that certain hawks account for the majority of predation on ruffed grouse. Certain hawks and owls that have exceeded the carrying capacity and have now no natural predators other than man. Man has a role to play in their management. Whenever the management of ruffed grouse is being discussed, regulated, targeted predator management of the most damaging predators needs to become a priority. And it's not even part of the conversation today. Politicians listen to the crowd, and politics will ultimately determine the fate of ruffed grouse. Politicians control the funding of fish and wildlife departments. Politicians can ask for and fund new research into raptor management that becomes the science that wildlife managers follow. Our game managers need timely research that arms them with data that establishes actual carrying capacities for specific accipiters, the bird-eating species of raptors. Management follows the science, and if no one is doing the research, the science isn't going to be there to support the management. If you continue to keep quiet and believe the only management solution for improving the grouse population is more of the same, creating more habitat, the species will continue to slide closer towards extinction. I hope you found the photos, research, and information in this video informative. This was not a subject that could be presented in a few minutes. It needed supporting scientific data and evidence. My goal for this video was to arm you with scientific data, call your attention to the fact that we are losing this species, encourage a more holistic approach for the management of ruffed grouse, and to inspire you to use your voice, your vote, and your resources to get involved in helping save this species. Lastly, I want to thank everyone who took the time to listen to this. I appreciate everyone who is trying to save this species. Find your voice, speak up, and do something. Long live the King of the Woods.